Hey everybody, welcome back. Again, if you're seeing this video, it means you've already completed the reading quiz, so hope you did well on that. Thanks for working on it. So our goal today is to get through chapter 1. And again, I've got the Ed puzzle thing going, so there will be some stops along the way. But again, don't worry about getting the answers right or wrong so much. It's just paying attention and following along. And I do have some, like a sort of a lecture guide, so you can print that out. I encourage you to take notes, so you can just have that open or print it out, take notes on it. But it just gives a little structure to what I'm going to be talking about, helps me keep my thoughts organized, and gives you a little something to follow along with. So hopefully that works out for you. But let's jump right into it. So the first thing I've got is we got to define this word social, right? Because everything that we're doing in sociology, we're talking about social structures, we're talking about social perceptions, social patterns, all these things, social. So let's just be real clear about when we're talking about social, we're talking about interaction, right? I just want you to think social means interaction. It means more than one person is involved. Now, just to complicate that a little bit, that doesn't necessarily mean more than one person is present, right? So an action can be interactional in nature or social in nature, even if only one person is around, right? So when I get up to go to work in the morning and I'm in the bathroom by myself, where I'm going and what I'm going to be doing makes a difference in how I prepare, right? Sometimes I'll shave, sometimes I'll put on a collared shirt, sometimes I'll just throw on a t-shirt, and it all just depends on where I'm going and who I'm going to be seeing and what sort of interaction I'm going to be going throughout that day. So even though I'm all by myself, right, it couldn't be more personal than just me alone in the bathroom. The decisions I'm making there are still social in nature because they involve the interaction that I'm looking forward to, that I'm thinking about, that I'm preparing for. So just keep that in mind. But still, when you see the word social, I just want you to think interaction. So let's get on to the sociological perspective, which was the basic title of this chapter. And the sociological perspective, I don't want to complicate it, right? It's pretty simple. It's just the idea that there are factors, social factors, what we call external forces, things that exist outside of the person, right? That impact and affect the way you go about your life. Now, these aren't physical structures, right? They're social ideas, right? But sociological perspective is that these social forces or these external forces that we're talking about have an effect on individual decision making and individual interaction. So these external forces are social in nature, which means they are rooted in interaction. Again, they become patterns, right? And so that's our next topic, right? Social structure. When you see that word structure, I just want you to think pattern, right? And again, we're talking about social patterns. That means patterns of human interaction. Now, not every pattern is necessarily a structure. It becomes a structure. These patterns become structures when they sort of become ingrained in our day-to-day life. As we're going about our business, we're going about our day-to-day life, we don't even necessarily give these ideas a second thought, but they are patterns, they are structures, at some point they were sort of created and didn't necessarily always exist. So when I think of these social patterns that maybe seem what we call self-evident, I mean, we just take it for granted. We just think they've always been there and that's always the way it is. It's always the way it has been. And we just don't give it much of a thought. We think about like the wage system, the idea that you get paid by the hour in a lot of jobs. And so that wage system it's something we just sort of take it as self-evident. Like, yeah, of course that's how you get paid. How else would you get paid if you're not on salary? But that's not always how it was, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about how that developed throughout the Industrial Revolution, which was a really important time for sociology, which was the birthplace of sociology, really. But we'll get to that. What's most important is that I just want you to think about the idea that these patterns of interaction that become ingrained over time, these are what we would call social structures. And they're a little bit different, a subtle difference between the idea of the social structures and social institutions. But we'll get into that more in a couple of weeks. when we talk more specifically about social institutions. But when we think social structures, about anything can be a social structure, from the wage system or keeping your money in a bank, or even just the way you interact with classmates, the way you interact in an elevator. I think the book talked about that, right? You don't just sit down in an elevator. That's kind of a social structure because it does constrict the way you behave, based on what's expected of you and who's around. And I'm going to switch over to some pictures so you're not just looking at my face all the time. There's Emil Durkheim. He's like the father of sociology, one of the first ones. And that's where sociology begins. It's the idea that these social patterns, whether they're traditions, values, religions, laws, right, are codified social norms. These sorts of things affect the behavior of the people who are in the society. And we'll talk more about Durkheim when we get to structural functionalism. Social environment, right? These are all the things. This is the world we live in, the social world we live in. All the inputs, all these external factors coming in from all sorts of different directions. That's what makes up our social environment. Again, you see that word social, so I just want you to think interaction. I also want to talk about sociological imagination, right? That was a big part of it. Now, the sociological imagination was pioneered by this guy, C. Wright Mills, back in the 50s, I think, 50s. There's C. Wright Mills, always famous for smoking that pipe. Of course, he died when he was 46 of heart attack, so I don't necessarily recommend smoking. But the sociological imagination is the idea that private problems, the personal issues that we go through, are impacted by these larger social forces. So the sociological imagination, if you go on to take social problems, you'll talk a lot more about the sociological imagination because that is where we really get into the root of social problems. But we got a nice quote there from C. Wright Mills. But these public issues arise from private problems. So I think the book gives the example of unemployment, and just pretty simple, right? The number of jobs that are out there in a given field impact how many people are employed in that field. And so, for instance, if you get a degree in nursing, you're in good shape because there are a lot of nursing jobs out there. But if you get a degree in engineering, there are a lot of people with engineering degrees who work in like sales or something like that. There aren't as many engineering jobs as there are people with engineering degrees. Honestly, it's the same with sociology. It's the social sciences in general. There are more people who have social science degrees than who actually work technically in a social science field. Now, that's not to dissuade any of you from your current major or anything, just the idea that the larger economy and the number of jobs that are out there has an effect on unemployment and who is unemployed, right? A lot of attention was paid in recent years to the coal mining industry, right? And the fact that we have been moving away from coal for a long time. And as a result, we're losing a lot of coal mining jobs. And that's causing all sorts of different problems in coal country, which is kind of, I spent 6 years up in Appalachia. So if I go back to coal miners a lot, it's because they got a special place in my heart. Let me pause it here and I'll come right back. So the next topic I wanted to address real briefly is the idea of public sociology. And traditionally, we called this positivism. That was in the 19th century, in the early part in the early existence of sociology. It was actually a little bit controversial of whether or not, as we began this sort of science of studying patterns of interaction and how people interact and what the consequences and effects were, it wasn't always a foregone conclusion that we should use that science to change things and to make positive changes in the way people live. There was a large school of thought that said that sociologists should be passive observers, that we just observe and document. And that was sort of the dominant school of thought for a long time. And then slowly but surely, this idea of public sociology and the idea that we could use sociology to make positive change in the world came about and really took a foothold in the 1950s and 60s. It had a lot to do with the civil rights movement in the United States. So that's public sociology. And that's the idea that that we can use sociology to create positive change. The next thing we're going to get to are the theoretical perspectives. So before we do that, let me take a pause. Social structures. So that section was a little rough. Didn't go as smoothly as I wanted it to, but I think you get the idea, right? Macro level, big picture, micro level, narrow, individual focus. And it's important to have both. They both have their benefits and they have to work together. And we like to think of, to go back to the sociological imagination, I like to think of the sociological imagination as a way to merge those two perspectives, the macro level and the micro level, right? The individual personal issues and troubles that people go through, that's the micro level focus. And then it takes a sociological imagination to see how the macro level patterns are having an effect at that individual micro level. So think of the sociological imagination as a way to connect the macro to the micro. And so now we're going to talk about the Industrial Revolution, and this is where sociology really came into being and became important. So hopefully we have some knowledge or some idea. This isn't the first time you've heard the word, the Industrial Revolution, but this was in mostly in the 19th century, basically the 19th century, as we started moving towards a manufacturing economy, right? And a lot of jobs were birthed in manufactured goods. And they were made in factories like this. So it took a lot of manual labor that was aided by, for that time period, were modern machines. A lot of steam power, often fueled by coal, right? I said I would go back to coal a lot, and there's an image of an early coal mine. It was a tough job then. It's still a tough job now. But these extractive industries really fueled the Industrial Revolution. But another big consequence of the Industrial Revolution was massive urban migration, right? They needed people to work in all of these factories. And as society became a little bit more specialized, and we'll get into that a little bit more over the specialization of labor, there was less need for sort of the agrarian lifestyle where everybody's kind of doing a little bit of everything. You're making your own food, you're making your own clothes, you're making all your own stuff. You move into the city and you have one job, you do one thing, and then you go to the store and you go to the market and buy the other goods that you need, the food, the clothes, and everything else. It's all already packaged and manufactured for you. So that's what we call the specialization of labor, right? We used to have, in an agrarian society, everybody kind of did everything. But as we moved through the industrialization, we moved toward a specialization economy where you had one job and then you sort of lived in a city where the other needs were available. So this is what city life in an industrial era town might have looked like. It wasn't pretty. A lot of overcrowding, a lot of trash. We just didn't have the infrastructure then to accommodate this massive influx of people to this city. We had, the plumbing couldn't keep up. The electricity couldn't keep up. So there were lots of blackouts, lots of fires, lots of sewage backups. I mean, these streets would often quite literally turn into rivers of human excrement. It was a pretty gross place to live. And some of these issues are kind of tough to see. Pollution was a bad problem, right? Tons of people, tuberculosis became an epidemic from people living in the cities and contracting these diseases because the air quality was so bad and there were so many people there. Child labor was a big problem. We didn't have any kind of labor laws, right? So we're talking about long hours for not much pay. And, the more work you could get for the cheaper was better. So children would work for low wages. And And so you had a lot of children working in these factories and in pretty dangerous conditions. So poverty, homelessness, obviously a tough problem. So there were a lot of issues in these cities, not the least of which was crime. So that's going to take us to our next point, right? So out of the Industrial Revolution came this need to sort of better understand how people operate, because the problems in the cities then were enormous, right? And one of the biggest issues that we saw was a rise in crime and violent crime. So this is where functionalism takes its place, right? So functionalism, as sort of coined by Emil Durkheim, functionalism says that society works like an organism, right? All the parts are separated and unique, but they all work together as a part of the whole. This is what we call the organismic analogy, right? That society is like a living organism, and it needs all these different parts. Everything serves some sort of function. So even though crime was the biggest thing that Durkheim was trying to solve with sociology, saying why are people being violent toward each other, stealing from each other, he still thought crime had a function, right? The crime and deviant acts that violated these social norms reinforced where the boundaries were, right? So the function of crime is to give us an idea of what is and is not acceptable behavior in our societies. So Durkheim saw the situation in the cities, and he saw the social decay, is what he called it, right? It was caused by a breakdown of social norms. So let's go back to this, right? Structural functionalism or functionalism is the idea that stability is key, right? And maintaining the social order is how society works. Everything is focused around maintaining this idea of stability or social order, right? One of the key words is this one down here, collective conscience. It's the idea that we have these ties to one another, right? That we live in a society where there are rules and there are behaviors, and if someone does something that shocks the collective conscience, there is some sort of widespread condemnation, right? And that's how crimes are born, right? Vandalism wasn't always a crime, but when some people started destroying property, it shocked the collective conscience. It was a shocking act, and people reacted to it in a way that created a demand to make it illegal, right? To respond to vandalism. It became something that was clearly against the social norms, and it was codified as such. So for Durkheim and the functionalists, this sort of phenomenon of the tragedies that were occurring in the midst of cities and the Industrial Revolution, the job of the sociologist wasn't necessarily to do much. The job of the sociologist was to find ways to reinforce values, to reinforce widespread values and bring everybody within the same collective conscience. Another key word here is anomie or anime, and that is the state of lawlessness or normlessness, right? It's the idea that when society breaks down and there are no longer norms, you get this sense of anomie or anime, and that's what for Durkheim, that's what was happening in the cities. That there are the social norms and the ties that bind people together into a society were breaking down, and we needed things like faith, family. We needed structure. Social institutions, social structures to bridge those broken ties. Conflict theory, like I said, a very different take on the problems that arose in the cities in the Industrial Revolution. Conflict theory centers on this idea of class, right? And originally, when Marx and Engels were kind of pioneering this theory, they saw two classes, right? And they were all based on this on economics, right? So we had the manufacturing economy. Let's put this on me. So we had the manufacturing economy. So we had two classes, right? You had the owners on one side and the workers on the other, right? And there were way more workers than there were owners. But the owners had all the power and all the control, and they were exploiting the workers. And for conflict theorists, right, the idea is that the sin is in the structure. It's not necessarily, and we're going to see a bad example of how sort of the billionaire class or the wealthy class was sort of villainized. But that wasn't necessarily what they were trying to get at. It was more the idea that the problem was in the capitalist system, and the capitalist system forced the people who owned the means of production, the people who owned the factories and the companies, they were, in order to stay competitive, they had to squeeze as much production as possible from their workers for as little compensation as they could give them, and that put a squeeze on workers to the point that you saw conditions deteriorate in the cities to what we've already seen, what we've already talked about, right? The pollution, the child labor, and the homelessness and the crime, and that was all just sort of a product of the capitalist system, because it encouraged or even kind of forced owners to be greedy and to exploit labor, right? So let's get on into this idea of exploitation, right? It's the idea that you're taking advantage of someone who is in a vulnerable situation, and you're taking advantage of that person for gain. Again, it's not necessarily about bad people doing bad things, as this cartoon sort of shows the billionaire. That's sort of the result, according to conflict theory. This is sort of the result of things, but it's not necessarily the fault of the billionaire. It's just this is the system we live in, and this is how the system works. So remember that when I talk to my social problems class, and if y'all go on to take social problems in the spring, you'll hear this a lot more, or in the fall. We're in the spring now. But if you go on to take social problems in the future, you'll hear more about the idea that the problems aren't necessarily in individuals doing bad things, but the problems are embedded in the structure. And that idea is born in conflict theory, because to the conflict theorists, all the problems are embedded in the capitalist system, right? So the sin is in the structure, and for Marx and for Engels, the only structure that mattered is the economy, which meant capitalism. Now, eventually, according to Marx, because there were so many more workers than there were owners, right? More people in the proletariat than the bourgeoisie, that eventually the workers were going to develop a class consciousness. They were going to realize their situation, and that they were going to violently overthrow their oppressors and install a communist utopia. Obviously, that didn't happen. There's a lot of reasons we don't necessarily need to get into, but only in one situation was there really a violent overthrow of the government, and that worked out to install a horribly brutal authoritarian regime that lasted for a long time. So, yeah, the Marxist tradition in academia is definitely a different thing from like full-fledged communism. The Marxist tradition, when you hear people talk about that in academia, it means that they are looking primarily at this idea of exploitation, right? That the system takes advantage of people, and that can happen along class lines. And then modern sociology, we really get into the class and chop it up and dissect way more. There's way more to social class than just economics, but we will get into that when we talk about class structures and when we talk about race and gender and all sorts of other things. The point is, Marx is an important figure in sociology and in the social sciences in general, because he sort of made us pay attention to this idea of exploitation, and that it's possible for people to be taken advantage of by a system, not just individual people, but by a social system, that a social system can be exploitative in nature. That's a really important idea that has had lasting effects that have lasted a lot longer than communism. And the last thing I want to mention about conflict theory and Marx and Engels is the idea of is the emergence of a middle class, which obviously Marx and Engels never thought was possible. And so that's sort of a merging of the two ideas of structural functionalism or functionalism. We kind of dropped the structural part off of it. I'm old. Functionalism and conflict theory, right? It took this idea of exploitation and blended it with the idea of sort of slow, gradual change. And slowly over time, and though violence was involved, so if you look at a history of the labor movement and you look at the way money bought such political clout, there was violence. There were strikes. There were strike breakers. There were terrorist bombings or anarchist bombings. There were all sorts of. There was a violent period of history, but eventually, by around the 1930s, and the Great Depression had a lot to do with this. We started codifying workers' rights, labor rights, and that's why we have things like a 40-hour work week and a minimum wage. And those are ideas and institutions that sort of help build a middle class. And again, according to Marx and Engels, a middle class was not possible under the capitalist system. The capitalists, the owners, the bourgeoisie would never have allowed that to happen. So symbolic interactionism, I note that it's probably the most complex of these because of its individual level focus, right? But it does away with this idea that we should seek to find some grand theory of everything or some grand theory that all of society is going to fit into. We can look at individuals and we can make scientific inquiries and draw scientific conclusions from observing the actions of a very small number of people, which was a pretty groundbreaking idea in sociology. These are the key things I want you to know, right? I want you to know that symbolic interactionism is a micro-level theory, which means it focuses on individuals and low-level interactions. And it's also how we sort of construct meaning. Symbolic interactionism, your root word there is interaction based on symbols. And so we're looking at the way we interpret interaction. And our interpretation of that interaction is sort of the way we construct our reality. So reality for a symbolic interactionist is rooted in perception, right? So here's this guy, W.I. Thomas, and his theorem states that if people define situations as real, they are real in their consequences, right? So to understand these human interactions, it's important to understand reality and perceived reality. So that gets real complicated, but let's look at it in this example, right? Just because a child believes there are ghosts doesn't mean that there are ghosts, but it will still keep that child awake at night. So it doesn't matter whether ghosts are real, really. The consequence is the same. The child is kept awake all night. So the example I put in our notes was the idea of just someone refusing to shake your hand. It could be a cultural thing, whatever causes that. But if you interpret it as a sign of disrespect, then the consequence will be that you treat that person as though they may have just disrespected you, whatever that might mean. And symbolic interactionism tends to borrow both from functionalism and conflict theory and to try to take those ideas and look at them at a micro level, right? So from functionalism, you've got the idea of social norms and the importance of social cohesion and sort of the idea of collective conscience of values and those ideas. Symbolic interactionism wants to document how those norms are reinforced at individual levels, right? It borrows from conflict theory as well, right? So SI or symbolic interactionism accounts for conflict theory and accounts for ideas like exploitation, but it wants to observe and document how exploitation affects individuals and what are the individual level real consequences of exploitation. And for the symbolic interactionist, whether the exploitation is real or not isn't that important, right? What is important is the perception of exploitation, because that's what people are reacting to. People react to their perceptions. So it becomes real subjective. And again, it's really tied heavily to this idea of research methods and how we are observing people go about their daily lives. We'll talk a lot more about symbolic interactionism in the next chapter when we get into qualitative research methods as opposed to quantitative. And ideas like participant observation or ethnography. We're going to talk about it, and hopefully symbolic interactionism will make a little bit more sense to you when we get into the methods. That's one of the key hallmarks of symbolic interactionism, is that the theory and the methods aren't separate. They are tied together, right? Your theory and your methods, they work together. They are one and the same, which is a really cool, really kind of next level concept that if I'm nerding out too much, I'm going to stop. So quick review of what we've talked about. Again, sociology, the study revolves all around interpersonal interaction, right? And you see the word social, I want you to think interaction. Sociological perspective as external forces. So when you see the sociological perspective, just know that we're looking at forces outside of the individual that affect the individual. Social structures, again, when you see the word social structures, I want you to think patterns, right? So you see social interaction, structures, patterns. So you look social structures, patterns of interaction that are sort of embedded in our culture. Sociological imagination, right? You're merging you're seeing the connection between the macro and the micro. The personal troubles, the micro, are connected to the big picture public issues. Functionalism, macro level concept, sees society functioning as a whole, right? So there's your root word, function. The key contribution is the idea that social norms help to maintain some sort of social order, right? That we live in a society, there are rules that you got to live by, and that's good for everybody. Conflict theory is another macro level theory. It sees social class and conflict between those classes as the hallmark of modern society. The key contribution there is the idea of social class and systematic exploitation, which again, that means that the exploitation occurs within the system. It's not necessarily about individuals doing bad things, but the system can cause exploitation. And finally, symbolic interactionism. Again, micro level, focusing on individual level interactions and how people perceive the world around them and how those perceptions sort of create a reality. And its key contribution is the development of those new and innovative techniques to study human behavior. So I focus on the strengths of each of these. There are drawbacks, and the book, I think, does a good job sort of addressing that none of these ideas are perfect. But I want to focus on the positive aspects, what we can pull from each perspective to help us understand them. And I should also include that I completely left out exchange theory and utilitarianism. And again, I'm going to reveal my bias. It's bunk. It's garbage. Don't worry about exchange theory. It's the idea that human beings are rational actors that always seek to maximize some sort of gain. It's crazy. It's ludicrous. These people clearly never met a single person in their lives. We don't act rationally. We're not rational creatures. We're emotional creatures. So just exchange theory. Can't believe they included it. So ignore exchange theory. You have my permission to completely disregard everything about exchange theory. So that's what we got. That's our video for today. Thanks for tuning in. And we have some more. Again, there's a discussion board for you to finish up. I want you to use that as that sociological imagination and see how take a public issue or a private trouble or personal trouble and show me how that's connected. I gave you an example of the opioid crisis and how that definitely is a personal trouble. It definitely affects individuals, but it's also part of a larger pattern. And I hope that makes sense to you. But of course, if you have any questions, shoot me an email, call my office phone, stop by the office. I still got cookies. So if you're local and you want to come by campus, I'll give you a cookie. That's what I got. Thanks, y'all. Have a good week.